For decades, the United States has stood for one idea above all others: freedom over tyranny. But in the Western Hemisphere, just miles from American shores, one country slowly moved in the opposite direction: Venezuela. Once one of the richest nations in Latin America, Venezuela collapsed under authoritarian rule, corruption, and repression. And at the center of that collapse stood one man, Nicolás Maduro. From Washington's perspective, this was never just about politics. It was about security, stability, and American values. The U.S. government accused Maduro's regime of dismantling democratic institutions, silencing opposition, imprisoning political rivals, and allowing criminal networks to operate with protection from the state itself. American officials went further, alleging that members of the Venezuelan government were involved in international drug trafficking, turning a sovereign nation into a narco-state. For the United States, this crossed a red line. Sanctions followed. Diplomatic pressure intensified. Naval patrols increased in the Caribbean. Not because America seeks conflict, but because history has shown what happens when tyranny is ignored close to home. While Maduro accused the U.S. of imperialism, millions of Venezuelans fled their country, escaping hunger, violence, and economic collapse. The largest refugee crisis in the history of the Americas unfolded in real time. To Americans watching from afar, the contrast was clear. On one side, a nation built on elections, institutions, and the rule of law. On the other, a regime clinging to power by force. The United States made its position clear. It would not recognize fraudulent elections, it would not legitimize dictatorship, and it would continue to apply pressure, economic, diplomatic, and strategic, until change became unavoidable. This was not about conquest, it was about deterrence, a message not just to Venezuela, but to the world. The United States will defend democratic principles in its hemisphere. It will protect regional stability, and it will never apologize for standing against authoritarianism. Whether the future brings reform, transition, or continued resistance, one fact remains unchanged. America did not choose this rivalry, but it will not walk away from it either. Because history has shown, when freedom is threatened, the United States responds.
For most Americans, Venezuela once felt distant, a country rich in oil, far south of the U.S. border, rarely mentioned in daily life. But history has a way of bringing distant places uncomfortably close. The conflict between the United States and Venezuela did not begin overnight. It was the result of years, decades of ideological collision, strategic concern, and a growing realization in Washington that instability in the Western Hemisphere could no longer be ignored. At the heart of the issue was power. When Hugo Chavez rose to power in the late 1990s, he presented himself as a champion of the poor, a man willing to challenge American influence. But behind the speeches and symbolism, Venezuela began drifting away from democratic norms. Independent institutions weakened, the press was pressured, the military became politicized. When Nicolás Maduro inherited that system, the situation worsened. From the American perspective, Maduro was not simply a foreign leader with a different ideology. He represented a dangerous precedent, a regime willing to dismantle democracy while maintaining power through force, propaganda, and fear. As Venezuela's economy collapsed, despite possessing the largest proven oil reserves in the world, millions of citizens fled. Entire families walked across borders with nothing but backpacks. Children went hungry. Hospitals failed. Cities descended into darkness. For U.S. policymakers, this was no longer a distant tragedy. It was a regional emergency. The United States had seen this pattern before. When authoritarian regimes collapse internally, the consequences spill outward. Mass migration, organized crime, instability, and the expansion of hostile influence. Washington began asking hard questions. What happens when a failed state sits near major shipping routes? What happens when criminal organizations find protection at the highest levels of government? What happens when rival powers gain a foothold in America's hemisphere? The answers were not theoretical. U.S. officials accused members of Maduro's inner circle of collaborating with international drug traffickers, turning Venezuela into a transit hub for narcotics bound for North America. These were not symbolic accusations, they were formal indictments. Sanctions followed, not against the Venezuelan people, but against individuals and structures tied to corruption and repression. The message was deliberate. The United States would not fund its own destabilization. Maduro responded with defiance. He blamed America for Venezuela's collapse, calling sanctions economic warfare. Yet the decline had begun long before sanctions were imposed. The truth was uncomfortable. Venezuela was collapsing under the weight of its own leadership. As tensions escalated, the United States increased its presence in the Caribbean. Naval patrols intensified, intelligence operations expanded, cooperation with regional allies strengthened. To critics, this looked aggressive. To supporters, it looked responsible. Because American history is shaped by one hard-earned lesson. Ignoring threats does not make them disappear. The Cold War taught this, the war on drugs reinforced it, and the 21st century made it unavoidable. The U.S. position became clear. There would be no military invasion, there would be no reckless intervention, but there would also be no recognition of fraudulent power. When elections were held without transparency, the United States rejected them. When opposition leaders were arrested, Washington spoke out. When protests were crushed, American officials documented it. This was not about domination, it was about standards. The United States does not claim to be perfect, but it does claim something else. The belief that power must be accountable and leadership must be chosen, not imposed. Meanwhile, Venezuelans continued to leave, by the millions. Entire towns emptied. Professionals, workers, students, people who once believed in their country walked away from it, not because of America, but because hope had been extinguished at home. Inside the U.S., the situation sparked debate. Some argued for stronger action, others urged caution, but across administrations, one principle remained constant. Maduro's regime could not be legitimized. America's strength has never been just military might. It is the ability to apply pressure without firing a shot, to isolate regimes diplomatically, to expose corruption, to deny legitimacy. And that pressure worked, slowly but unmistakably. Maduro remained in power but isolated. His allies dwindled, his economic options narrowed, his legitimacy eroded. The United States had not won in a dramatic sense, but it had reshaped the battlefield, without bombs, without invasion, without sacrificing American lives. This is how modern power operates, not through conquest, but through endurance, not through chaos, but through consistency. The rivalry between the United States and Venezuela is not a war of armies, it is a war of systems. One system depends on fear, control, and silence. The other depends, imperfectly but persistently, on institutions, accountability, and the idea that power belongs to the people. The story is not finished. Venezuela's future remains uncertain. But one reality is already clear. The United States did not retreat, did not surrender influence, and did not abandon its principles in the face of authoritarianism. Because American leadership has never been about ruling others, it has been about setting limits. Limits on tyranny, limits on corruption, limits on the belief that power can exist without consequence. And in that sense, the conflict between the United States and Venezuela is not just a regional dispute, it is a reminder that freedom is fragile, that democracy must be defended, and that when instability rises in the Americas, the United States does not look away. It watches, it prepares, and when necessary, it acts.
As the pressure campaign continued, something important began to change, not in headlines, but beneath the surface. For decades, the United States had learned that authoritarian regimes rarely collapse suddenly. They erode, slowly, quietly, often from within. And Venezuela was no exception. While Nicolás Maduro maintained control in Caracas, the structure holding him up became increasingly fragile. Loyalty inside the military was no longer absolute. Economic collapse weakened patronage networks. International isolation reduced maneuvering room. Even longtime allies became cautious. From Washington's perspective, this was not a moment for spectacle, but for patience. American intelligence agencies closely monitored financial flows, communications between regime figures, and the movements of key individuals tied to corruption and organized crime. The goal was not chaos, the goal was accountability. In the United States, this approach reflected a deeper strategic tradition. America does not seek to rule other nations, but it also refuses to normalize tyranny. This balance between restraint and resolve has defined U.S. foreign policy at its best moments. And Venezuela became a test case of that philosophy in the modern era. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials worked with partners across Latin America and Europe. Diplomacy was relentless, sanctions were calibrated, legal pressure increased. The message was consistent. There would be no military conquest, but there would also be no escape from consequences. At the same time, the United States expanded humanitarian efforts for Venezuelan refugees. Billions of dollars were directed toward aid, resettlement, and regional stabilization. This distinction mattered. The conflict was never with the Venezuelan people, it was with a system that had failed them. American policymakers understood something fundamental. When a regime loses the trust of its people, it survives only by force, and force is expensive, unsustainable, fragile. Inside Venezuela, daily life became a struggle.
Electricity outages lasted days. Fuel shortages paralyzed transportation. Inflation erased savings overnight. The middle class, once the backbone of the nation, collapsed. Every one of these failures weakened the regime's grip, and every year that passed without legitimacy strengthened the American position. Critics often asked, why not intervene directly? The answer was rooted in history. America has learned, sometimes painfully, that lasting change cannot be imposed at gunpoint. Real stability comes when internal pressure aligns with external accountability. So instead of invasion, the U.S. chose something far more dangerous to authoritarian systems: time. Time exposes lies. Time drains fear. Time makes repression visible. As evidence of corruption mounted, international courts took notice. Financial networks were disrupted. Travel restrictions isolated elites. Assets were frozen. What once looked like untouchable power began to feel narrow and confined. Maduro still stood at the podium, but the room around him was emptying. For the American public, this conflict rarely appeared dramatic. There were no televised battles, no declarations of war. But in reality, it represented a new model of American strength. Strength without occupation, pressure without destruction, leadership without conquest. This is what power looks like in the 21st century. And it sends a signal far beyond Venezuela. To every authoritarian regime watching closely, the message was clear. You may control your streets, but you do not control the world. The United States, for all its internal debates and imperfections, still shapes global standards. It still defines legitimacy, and it still possesses the institutional patience to outlast regimes built on fear. For Americans, this story is not about Venezuela alone. It is about borders. It is about security. It is about the responsibility that comes with power. When instability spreads in the Americas, the United States cannot pretend it does not matter. Geography does not allow that luxury. History does not forgive that mistake. So the United States remains engaged, not loudly, not recklessly, but decisively. Watching, waiting, applying pressure where it matters. Because American leadership has never been about dramatic victories. It has been about shaping outcomes over time. And in the long arc of history, systems built on repression do not win wars of endurance. They collapse under their own weight. The future of Venezuela will be decided by Venezuelans, but the environment in which that decision unfolds has already been shaped. Shaped by diplomacy, shaped by law, shaped by a nation that understands something fundamental about power. That true strength is not proven in how fast you act, but in how long you can stand firm without losing your principles. And that is why, even without a single shot fired, the rivalry between the United States and Venezuela has become one of the most revealing geopolitical confrontations of our time. Not because of who conquered whom, but because of who refused to surrender standards.